Live from New Hampshire, it's time for the Science Cafe!
Learn about the latest technologic innovations today.
And you don't have to pay.
Expert panels with advanced degrees are sure to satisfy your curiosity.
Did we mention it's free?
And if you think you'll find a better time than this, then come on down and test your hypothesis. Cause you're gonna learn a lot if you wanna stay down at the Science Cafe.
So we've been doing Science Cafe for almost 8 years. We've hosted over 100 sessions, topics ranging digital security, vaccinations, West Nile disease, electric cars, 3D printing. There's a list that goes on and on. So and MS, yeah, that was another one. We also have another operation in Concord, so we organize 2 Science Cafes. But if you're into science, there's also one that is started in Manchester. There's one in Portsmouth, and there's one in Lebanon. So we're lucky in New Hampshire. We have a lot of science cafes that have crept up, and David Brooks, one of our other co-founders, jokes that we have the highest science cafes per capita in the country. And he's probably right. So tonight we're here to talk about gardening and preparing the soil and what we need to do to get ready for spring, and we have one panelist who's not yet here. Hopefully he's stuck in traffic. So part of the feedback that we got from people who do come to Science Cafe is that we need to tell you a little bit more about the people. So in the spirit of that, I'll share that Gene Harrington is the co-owner of Nashua Farmers Exchange on Bridge Street. He's a returning panelist and brings over 35 years of experience to our gardening discussion. Gene holds degrees in both wildlife biology and entomology and is one of Nashua region's go-to experts when it comes to lawn, vegetable, and perennial gardening. Gene Harrington. All right. Next we have Cameron Bonsey, who's from the coast of Maine. Oh, our third panelist. Come on up. You must be Jonathan. Please have a seat.
Thank you very much.
Okay. How's that? So next I was introducing Cameron Bonsey, who's from Coast of Maine, Portland. And he is the Director of Marketing for Coast of Maine Organic Products. And he's been with the company since 2007. He's also a returning panelist and an expert on the benefits that microbrewed compost blends made from ocean byproducts bring to our gardens. Well, that's not something accessible to just everybody, but we'll be interested to hear about that. And finally, okay. This is great. It's like a real event. And lastly, we have Jonathan Ebba, who's from the UNH Cooperative Extension, Hillsborough County. Jonathan is a field specialist for commercial horticulture with UNH Cooperative Extension. He also teaches classes in horticulture, specializing in greenhouse management and greenhouse crop production at the Thompson School. He is a grower of both wholesale and retail commercial greenhouses for 18 years prior to joining UNH. So I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves a little bit more, and then maybe you could touch on what excites you about spring, and then we'll turn the discussion over to the questions from the audience. So remember, raise your hand, and we'll come and bring a microphone to you. So we'll start with Gene.
Many of my faces I see out there are familiar, so please forgive me if I'm getting a little repetitive over the years, but I have been here a little bit more than 35. It's more like 42 years now this spring. But it's one of the things that I really like doing, so it's not work, it's like. That's another 4-letter word. What I really like about gardening, though, is I've always liked growing things. I've got to get my fingers into that soil. I've got to get it working, and I've got to have things happening. And one of the things that I wanted to mention tonight for certain is that people think everything happens at the same pattern, and it doesn't. There are many different plants out there that act differently according to certain inputs. One of the comments, and Sandy put it in her article, was about onions. You know, people want to grow big, nice onions, but they wait until Memorial Day to plant them, and they never get a decent onion. And they come in the store and they say, I never get a decent onion. What's the matter with my soil? And I say, when did you plant it? Onions grow, they put out more foliage as the days lengthen. Once the day length stops lengthening, they don't put on any more foliage, they convert to putting out root material. So if there's not much foliage out there, if you wait till Memorial Day to plant, you've got 3 weeks, 4 weeks worth of foliage growth, and the bulb doesn't have much foliage to put energy into it. Onions should be going in right now. We just got in a shipment this afternoon of some beautiful onion plants, and these are the actual plants. These aren't the sets. We have sets, we've had them for a few weeks. But these are the actual plants that we contract with a grower in Texas. He plants them the first week in January, and they've been growing down there in South Texas, and he dug them last week and shipped them up. These are like the Walla Walla onions. My wife grew one 1 year, 9 inches in diameter. But you got to get it in soon if you want to get something like that. So that's what I think about when I start thinking getting the garden ready in spring. You should have your peas in already. You know, how many people out there have your peas in? There's a few. I've got ours in. It's a good time for lettuce. There's a bunch of cold weather crops that like cool weather. They're not necessarily photoperiod oriented like the onions, but they like the cooler weather to grow in. So you want to get those in the garden as quick as you can too.
My name's Cameron Bonsey. I'm the Director of Marketing for Coast of Maine Organic Products. I did not grow up gardening. I did grow up, like probably most of you in here, playing outdoors a lot and not having much parental supervision, which was sometimes a good thing and sometimes a bad thing. And I came to Coast of Maine with just a little bit of experience on the gardening side in 2007. I've learned a lot about compost and soil. I'm not an expert gardener for any means, but one of the things that we do at Coast of Maine is we make a world-class product, and then we have world-class retailers like Gene sell it. And we refer a lot of people to small retailers like the Nashua Farmers Exchange. They're hugely important to the local community. And we also refer a lot of people to their local Cooperative Extension to answer questions. So there may be a lot of questions coming at me that I just look at Gene or I look over here because I'm not as sure as they are. But on the compost side of things, we have always been organic. We do have a unique blend of products that we do. Happy to answer any questions in that way, but I don't have all the answers. But thank you for being here, and buy local, think organic.
I am Jonathan. At this point in my life, I'm an educator. My trajectory with plants has been kind of a varied one, and I won't bore you with it all, but I had been a producer both of field crops, but then largely greenhouse crops. And then I had the privilege of teaching young people and some older people how to do that professionally at the Thompson School. And now I'm switching to Cooperative Extension, where I help our greenhouse producers in the state do so more sustainably and more profitably. That involves ornamentals, which I realize isn't the topic of conversation for today, and also a lot of hydroponic production. The greenhouse industry in the state has become so mature that additional profits that are being squeezed out are being done through efficiencies. And so it's exciting one of the questions was what's exciting us now about spring. The level of precision and technology that's being used now in the greenhouse industry in terms of manipulating light, not only quantity, but quality and wavelength, manipulating carbon dioxide, the level of precision that we can get with our nutrients and whatnot is really exciting to me. Personally, I grow at my own house using organic methods, but what I teach and what I do professionally is not organic in the sense of cultivating soil, right? I don't know if that'll come up tonight or not, but we might have a discussion about is hydroponic organics an oxymoron or not? And just because hydroponics uses ionic fertilizers, does that make it bad in some way? And are we actually able to do hydroponic production not organic using fewer pesticide inputs than some conventional or even organic production? So I don't know if those conversations will come up tonight or not, but I'm excited about the level of science that is happening at most levels of greenhouse crop production in New Hampshire right now.
So I'm a new gardener. I have a raised bed garden, and I plant plants that I buy at Home Depot, which is, I'm sure there's a better way, but I find I don't get any yield from them. I get great lettuce, I get really good tomatoes, but squash and watermelon and peppers and things, I get very little yield from them. Is it because I need to add something to my soil?
My first reaction to that would be, have you had a soil test? I think that would be the first thing that I would advise her to do.
I even more fundamentally, is this working? I might even, my first question would be light, but then certainly then we'll go to soil. Okay, thanks.
And I guess that's, so you're doing a raised bed, do you amend it at all? Well, do you fertilize it?
I have access to some good goat poop. I was thinking about putting that in, but I have never added anything to the soil, but I've used it, I think, 4 years now.
Your soil's probably exhausted. If you haven't been reviving it in a sense, you're going to need to add organic material.
Okay.
I'm assuming you don't compost yourself.
No.
Okay.
I'm really new at this, and I
so-
don't know what I'm doing at all.
Yeah,
so.
no, that's good. Those are the types of questions that I want. You'll be getting a hat because these are for the easy questions that I actually know something about. So I think that one of the things that you really need to do is to be at least top dressing with some organic material. We happen to make compost blends that are already set for you that you can top dress with even in the fall or the spring that are going to actually add biology to that soil so your plants can feed. Is this the basic part of it? If you're just planting a plant, that plant's going to use the biology that's already in the soil, and then it's saying, well, I need more food, basically. It's like, do you keep your refrigerator empty at home? Do you have teenagers? Because they won't allow that, right? So it's kind of the same thing. What are you replacing in that refrigerator so that those plants can feed? And if you're doing it, you don't have to be super scientific or sophisticated with that. It's just always putting that organic matter back into the soil, whether it's leaves, whether it's your own local grass clippings, whether you're doing, I do encourage you to do some composting on your own because you can do a lot of that and put that on into your raised bed. It's mixing up crops too, and doing different cover crops. But those are the basic places. And then you want to go visit Gene, not go to Home Depot, because then you can get the answer and you wouldn't have wasted 4 years trying to figure out why it wasn't growing.
The only thing I wanted to add is, as you were saying, that the plants are going to be mining some of the material out of that soil, and you need to replace what they're mining out. You can do it with pure compost if you want. However, compost is extremely low in a lot of those nutrients. So someone makes a product called Stonington Kelp and something else. It's a nice little bag fertilizer that is very concentrated and works great on most of your crops to replace some of the stuff that's being mined out of the soil. But if you'd rather go with just the compost, you can go with straight compost, but you're talking about 3 or 4 inches deep every year at that point.
May I just say to that, so fundamentally, if we took a plant, a healthy plant, and put it in an oven and cooked all the water out of it, so there's no water in there, right? It's all just crispy and dry, and we analyzed the elements in there, right? Because all biology is just an assimilation of elements, things we would see on the periodic table. Like 89, forgive me if I get these numbers wrong, but like 89% of the mass of that plant after we took out the water would be carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And that came from the air, and it came from when photosynthesis split water apart. So the mass of a plant isn't coming from the root zone at all. However, the other 11%, when we look at a bag of fertilizer and we see those 3 numbers up front, right, that's nitrogen, phosphorus kind of, and potassium kind of, the percentages of those, and then calcium and sulfur. That's the next like 10%, if I'm doing my math right, 10.5% of that weight. And then all the micros, so the iron, magnesium, manganese, et cetera, that's like 0.5%. And so it's really a very, very small part. When we pull out all this plant matter and we think, well, I'm pulling out more than I put in there, most of that plant mass is coming from the air. But those micronutrients are absolute, and the macronutrients are absolutely critical to the development of that plant. And so there's a bajillion different ways that we can provide that. And we hinted a little bit at the organic matter maybe not having as much as, say, a fertilizer would. When we talk about fertilizers, we're talking about that 11% that we want to add. But of course, Cameron can talk better than I can about the advantages of having that organic material in there to make those fertilizers more available.
One last quick comment for you, though. As a new gardener, I totally recommend get a notebook. Write down what you do at different times so that next year you can refer back, and the year after that you can refer back, and maybe you can see what happened one year when you had great lettuce and lousy tomatoes, and the next year you had great tomatoes and lousy lettuce.
Okay, the next question's coming from the center of the room.
I have a problem in that I don't have a lot of sun in my yard. Used to have sun, but my neighbor has a tree now that's grown too big. So I have just it's a balancing act. I have a small area that gets sun a fair amount of the day, and I have to grow in containers because it's on a cement walk. And so last year I bought the Coast of Maine soil and I used that. How do I perk it up? And you've kind of answered some of those questions already, but how can I make it produce the best it can produce with the limited space and time, sunlight that I have?
We can actually, the way we look at sunlight is and I won't go too deep into this unless people want it in a follow-up question, but we actually count the packets of energy that are coming out of the sun, and we can add that up over a day. And could you know offhand how many hours of sun you have during the peak season, direct sun on those containers? Did you say from 10 to 3? Yeah. Yeah. And it's direct during that time?
Yep.
Yeah, so stuff where we eat the fruits, so squash, tomato, whatever, melon, stuff like that, needs more photons over the course of a day than stuff where we're eating the foliage, right? So lettuce is one if we're kind of pushing the boundaries. I'll defer to Gene on onions if he would recommend maybe green onions and something like that. But one thing I'm going to say, I'm sorry to say, but we might want to back off some of the real high demand vegetables in terms of sunlight. I don't think we want to talk about artificial light in here, but that, if you want, I'll tell you how to set up in your house and you can do it all in there too.
What I would say about the onions, yeah, you're not going to get much of a bulb produced, so you can go for green onions, scallions, or something like that. But the other thing I would encourage totally is, can you put your containers on one of those little red carts and maybe move it across the driveway as the day goes on? So now you're getting sun from like 9 until 4, something like that. And the other thing to consider is maybe a trellis or something going up the side of the house to get more of the sun that's not right on the ground. When you're growing in a container, you can start playing with where your plant is in the environment to try to maximize the amount of sunlight you're getting on it. And that can help in a tight situation. You can also ask the neighbor about pruning the tree.
How big is the container that you're using?
4 feet by 2 feet.
Okay, so it's a large.
Yeah.
It's a large container.
And 2 feet deep.
Okay, and then do you happen to know what product you used? Did you use a potting soil? Did you use an amendment? Do you know what you used?
I got it from Gene last year.
Okay.
So
Okay.
whatever he recommended.
Okay. Well, the only reason I ask that is that if you're using a compost-based soil, there's going to be certain different designs for the soil as far as drainage and how dense it is. With a container that size, Gene may have given you something like our lobster compost. If it was a smaller container, he may have given you something like our Bar Harbor blend. The only reason I mention that is that we have a potting soil, which is Bar Harbor blend, and there's less compost in it, so there's less biology in there too. So especially if you have any type of heavy feeding plant at all, you're going to have to add something additional to it, some additional fertilizer to it along the way. The heavier base compost, you won't need it as much because there's just naturally more biology in that heavier base compost.
So I compost a lot of my leaves. I have a lot of maple trees, and I have a huge pile that I put in my back field that I've been composting for 2 years now. And we turn it periodically, and it's really composted down quite nicely. When you said that compost can get too hot, my question then is, should the compost be in the sun? Should it be in the shade, or does it matter?
It doesn't matter. It will make a difference in a certain way where you have it and how it is exposed in a sense. What you're doing on a smaller scale is you're probably never going to be able to heat up those piles the way that I was talking, because we're doing massive windrows that are literally 8 feet high, maybe 12 feet wide, and 100 yards long. And so there's a huge amount of volume of things that are happening in there. And so that will heat up, and it'll heat up enough so that people use compost now to heat houses, and they use it to generate energy and to do all kinds of wonderful things. Your pile's probably not going to heat up that much, but the key that you want to try to do as often as possible is to turn it a little more often. Mm-hmm. You're going to get pockets in there that may not be as good. There may be a situation became anaerobic, and you can smell it. I mean, if the compost smells more like earth, then you know it's okay. If it has any kind of ammonia smell, or if it's warm to the touch, you probably don't want to put that on your plants. I've had a lot of local composters that will become popular, and then they'll start selling their compost before it's ready to go, and it will show up at somebody's house and it's steaming and it smells. Don't do it. It's not going to be good for your plants. It's probably going to damage your plants. So when you open up a bag of soil that's compost-based, or you got your own compost in your backyard, it shouldn't be warm, and it shouldn't smell. It should be earthy.
Yeah, I just want to follow up real quick on your last part of your question about, is it fine to put on the plant? And that's because I can think of at least 3 times in recent past when we've had customers that had large volumes of compost applied, and they come into us later with pictures and say, how come these plants aren't growing the way the ones at home are, or the ones that my neighbors are, or whatever? Something is going wrong. All 3 of those times, the compost was not completely composted. You could still identify individual components of the carbonaceous material in there. If you're using shavings in it, if you're using leaves that you can still identify as a leaf, that compost is not done yet. Okay. And as you put that out on your plant as a quote-unquote top dressing or as a fertilizer application, it's actually going to steal some of the nitrogen away from that plant and slow down the growth rather than feeding it. So if you can identify the individual components visually in that compost, it's not composted yet.
I'm interested in the birds and the bees, mainly pollinator gardening stuff. Can you educate us about that? And, I've heard things like it can actually make a difference if gardeners grow certain kinds of flowering plants. So can you educate us a little?
I'll just say, in terms of making a difference, I mean, we have, there's a lot of citizen science websites, and we're actually seeing anecdotally what seems to be making a difference on monarchs, just because people have really doubled down on being intentional about giving them places to land and live. What do they need? Well, so monarchs are exclusively, the question is, what do they need? So monarchs are exclusively milkweed, right? I got to think about where to take this conversation. So pollinators, a lot of times people are thinking honeybees, and honeybees are fantastic, but they're not from here. People are like, if the honeybees go, we all die. It's like, well, maybe not, maybe not, but they're not from America. But in New Hampshire, we have, I want to say, hundreds of species of native solitary bees that we can be helping. So some research was just done with alyssum. For ages out west in California, they've been growing alyssum alongside their vegetable crops. And not only is alyssum feeding the pollinators, but it's also feeding a lot of the beneficial insects too that are going over to eat the aphids or to eat the thrips that are in the lettuce, stuff like that. So alyssum is a great one. There's an interesting thing now about native plants versus native species versus non-native species, and I'm not willing yet to put a stake in the ground on what I think about that, but there may be some evidence that the native species of plants sounds kind of intuitive, are a better bet for the native species of pollinators.
Diversity is the key in the yard. As much as a commercial farmer is going to want to grow one crop on a fairly large area so he can manage it or she can manage it well, if you're trying to help pollinators, if you're trying to help birds in your backyard, you want a diverse range of blooms and bloom times and heights of the bloom and size of the bloom, the colors involved. I was involved last night with a recommendation. There was a commercial site that was going to put in an entire monoculture of one plant as a screen around the edge. And I suggested 2 other times to mix in with it so they had a diversity of plant material there and a diversity of what would be food sources in the winter for some of the wild birds in that area. I'm a big proponent of don't plant too much of any one thing in any one spot. Plant 4 or 5 or 6 things in it. Let everybody enjoy it.
And so everyone's doing Cameron's advertising for him, but I have to keep pushing mine. So Cooperative Extension does have information on establishing wildflower meadows, on planting for pollinators, planting even for birds and things like that, planting for wildlife. So UNH Cooperative Extension, particularly with the Ed Center, which is sort of our homeowner outreach, does have some good information there too.
How long does it usually take for a pile of leaves to compost down? This is like on its 2nd year now.
That totally depends on how much it's been turned. Is it being accentuated by some sunlight to it? Did you add enough green material to the leaves? Everybody talks about, I'm going to use leaves for the brown material and I'm going to use the grass clippings for the green. But we get a big slug of leaves in the fall and we get a big slug of grass clippings in June. And they're not at the right times. And you do need to commingle them in the pile so that the guibos, all those micro critters that are in there trying to blend that stuff together can get a mouthful of each and live happily ever after.
We do a specific ratio of carbon to nitrogen when we do our piles, and there's specific recipes. Lobster shells themselves, on average, take about 8.5 months to break down, but that's totally different than a leaf. When you get a lobster shell, we're bringing it in, and it's being run over by this giant scarab, and it does break down a lot. At the end of the time of 8.5 months, and we're putting that in a bag, it's broken down. You don't see any lobster shells. It's just rich and dark. It smells like earth. And occasionally, you do get a rubber band in there, and you occasionally get a little lobster knuckle that's in there too. But it should be completely broken down, and it should, again, smell like earth and be rich and dark.
I was wondering, because there are living things in soil and compost and that sort of thing, is there a shelf life to the bags of soil and compost that you have? And what is the difference as far as storing them? So, if you open a bag, you use half of it, you leave it in your garage, is it less effective the following season? Is it kind of not so effective 5 years from now?
Sure.
How does that work?
So the short answer is yes. What you find with our products, we'll make a lot of product in the fall, and we overwinter it, and it freezes. And a lot of that biology becomes dormant, and then it comes back in the spring. We've had very little issues with that, but always the bag of compost that's been stored and taken care of fairly a short period of time is going to be a little bit better. We have products that have mycorrhiza in them that you'll lose a lot of mycorrhiza if it freezes. You may lose all of it. With us, it's about the balance of the soil, but you want to take that bag, keep it in a cool, dry place. You can use it the next spring. It should work pretty well. And we've never had any complaints about the efficacy. But yeah, something that's been sitting in a bag for 5 years, it may have a little less biology, but it's still going to be good for the soil.
Hollyhocks. I had them. Love them. Never came back. And lupines. Why do they grow in a field out in the middle of Maine and New Hampshire, but they won't grow in my yard? I plant one and it never comes up.
You had the hollyhocks for a number of years? Or just one?
Couple of years, but they're biennials, right?
Some hollyhocks are biennials. Some hollyhocks, yeah. It can be that you happen to hit that one bad year when the weather conditions weren't quite right. It goes too dry and you missed the right time to water it, or it got too wet and you didn't turn the sprinkler off in time and the roots got phytophthora or something like that and it killed them. At the same time, you will find the places where the soil conditions are much more appropriate for individual kind of plants. You know, over in New York State, where my family's old farm is, the hollyhocks that I think it was my great-grandmother planted out near the old outhouse, you know, they're still blooming. Well, yeah, it did have a fertilizer source there. But you know, it's amazing when you take an individual plant, and I have done that. I've planted certain plants here in New Hampshire and planted some plants of that exact same stock that same weekend over in New York State. And in 3 years, you'd swear they were two totally different plants, the way they grew. Because the soil over there has an awful lot of clay in it, and it's actually a limestone-based soil. So it has a lot more calcium in it, too. We never have to add lime over there, because that's what the soil's made up of, is ground lime. But totally different. So sometimes it's a matter of just looking at the kind of soil you have. Lupins do seem, in my opinion, to want more clay in the soil. They want some of the finer soil particles. And right around here, there's only a few isolated pockets on some of the drumlins where you have some clay soils. Other than that, we have pretty drainy soils around here.
I would add too. So just in general, what a biennial is, in case anyone doesn't know, is the seed hits the ground and it grows into a plant that just has leaves. And then winter comes. And then the next year, it goes and becomes a flowering plant, right? So parsley, believe it or not, is a perennial. And that's why it does that pain in the butt thing where the next year, it's like, yay, my parsley survived the winter, but it doesn't give you any leaves because all it wants to do is flower. So hollyhock, unlike parsley, we want the flowers the second year, right? So that and then after it blooms, that individual plant dies forever. It's done. It's gone, right? So 1 year is, we say, the rosette. 1 year's green. The next year blooms. This is the rule. Of course, there's exceptions to all these rules, right? But the rule is first year is green, second year is flowering, and then it's smoked. So with hollyhocks, I'll always make sure that I'm planting. I'll just take the seeds, and they make that neat little cheese wheel, and I'll spread them out on the ground. And then I treat them as if I had just sown seeds. And so I'm making sure they're well watered and whatnot until they germinate. Another nice thing about doing that is that you can see I haven't spent the time to figure out who it is, but somebody gets inside there and eats his way through all those seeds sometimes. So when you're spreading them, if there's a hole drilled through each of those little seeds, there's no seed there, right? It's some worm ate it, and I don't know who that was. And the second thing is that I should know. You're right. And and with lupins, the ones that we see in Maine, believe it or not, are not our native lupins, right? So that's lupinus. Nice. Well, that's polyphyllate. Lupinus perennis is the flower isn't as striking. It's a much simpler flower with more space in it. But that's the sole food source for the Carner blue butterfly if we're talking about our insect health. And they're, in my experience, difficult to get established. But once the Lupinus perennis, the natives, are established, they do a better job coming back. But they're not those breathtaking weeds on the side of the main highways.
Is how do we manage pests in our garden? We haven't talked about pests. And I think that's really an important thing to get ahead of, because I know once you get, last year I had hornworms, and I just couldn't believe what was going on in my garden. These things were, no kidding, that big, and as big around as my thumb. It was amazing. So anyway, if you guys could just talk to each other about how do you manage pests, what are the best things to do, and then we'll come back to audience questions when the hat's done going around the room.
Well, the first thing I would do about managing pests in my garden is to look to see if I have a pest and what pest it is. Because just because something doesn't grow the way I want doesn't mean it's a pest doing it. Yes, I have a degree in entomology. I do look at the insects. I know what a lot of them are. And I've spent a lot of time studying plant diseases to try and help the clientele out there figure out what they are. So that's what you do. You observe and see what's out there, what is normal and what is not normal. And then you just try to get you as close to normal as you can.
Actually, I just want to thank the audience first, because I'm sitting between two science-based folks that use big words, and I love an audience that will laugh at outhouse humor. It makes me feel better. But the basic piece to remember with any pest is that the pest is going to go to the weakest plant. So if your plants are strong and healthy, that's going to cut down on some of your plant and pest issues. There are various organic things that can make your plant stronger and more disease resistant, and there's various organic products that can help to reduce pests. The chitin that I mentioned in the lobster shells actually has some pesticidal. When the chitin breaks down in the composting process, it becomes chitinase, and then it also wants to break down chitin. So it actually attacks insects that have a chitin. Obviously, insects have chitin in their shells, so it actually helps to mitigate insects in that way too.
It maybe sounds a little hippy-dippy, but I kind of enjoy some of the pests in my garden, and I mean they're fascinating organisms, you know, and when they get out of control, I think like Cameron was alluding to, you know, that something's wrong. You know, there's something not right. And I won't say that about in the greenhouse, right? The natural state of affairs in the greenhouse is to get overrun with pests. That's just what they want to do in those contrived environments. But so we can talk about how to kill different things and when you should kill different things and how to prevent certain things. But I guess I just in general would encourage you to look at pests and disease. Like hollyhock, when you mentioned hollyhock, I'll catch you later. When you mentioned hollyhock, do you have hollyhock rust? Those little orange pustules on the underside of the hollyhock leaves? That stuff is fascinating. That is a fascinating disease, right? And I don't want to like completely say insects that eat plants are horrific and they all need to die. That's not my position. A lot of them are really fascinating. And I would say, too, in addition to what Jean said, just because an insect does take a bite or two out of your leaf doesn't mean it's, you know, an enemy which must be annihilated either. There are some things that have to be annihilated, you know. Squash vine borer, you can't have that if you want squash. Squash bugs, you can't have that if you want summer squash. I mean, there's some things we have to deal with. But not everything that eats a leaf is a detriment to the plant. When I worked retail garden center, people would always bring in their stuff for diagnosis, and they'd give me a leaf with a hole in it and say, something's killing my tree. And I'm like, well, you know, how widespread is this? Do you have defoliation? No, I just saw this leaf. It's like, well, you know, we'll walk in the woods and find me a leaf that doesn't have some sort of hole or bump or deformity or something like that.
And I just want to follow up on Jonathan's comment about not all the bugs are bad. Those of you up close enough to see this picture up here that I brought in, you know, here's the hornworm that Dan was talking about. And it's got all these funny little white things on it. And I've had people say, oh, those are eggs. Well, those aren't eggs. Those are pupae of a wasp. That's a wasp that stings hornworms. It's a parasite of hornworms. So it's a very good and beneficial insect to welcome into your garden. And one of the neat things about this particular picture, the reason I took it originally, was We have several ways to control hornworms on tomato plants. There are some of the traditional poisons. There are some of the less traditional, more natural ones. But the one I love to use is called Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a bacteria. We call it just BT for short, for those that can't pronounce it as fast as I do. But the neat thing about BT is the way it works. It's a stomach disease of caterpillars. They eat a couple bites of it, and they can't eat anymore. So they're not chewing up your plant. However, they haven't died. They're still alive. When they're going to die is probably from starvation because they can't eat. But while they're alive, that wasp can come by and sting them, and then the offspring of that wasp can fly out and find more hornworms in your garden and sting them. So by using something like BT to control the first couple hornworms, you haven't eliminated all the friendly insects in your garden that are going to try and take care of other pests for you.
I'll plug for Gene too. So again, I was in retail before at an independent garden center, and I know that the chemicals at Walmart and Home Depot are like a little bit cheaper than the chemicals at the independent garden center. But I really, really would ask that you work with folks like Gene and work with your local independent garden center who can spend the time and help you actually diagnose what you have, so you're not putting down chemicals that you don't need to use, and can have a more holistic approach to help you fix your garden rather than just walking down the aisle at the depot and being like, kills insects.
You'll also find that type of passion that you're seeing right there at your local independent garden center. People that really know what they're talking about, live it, know it, want you to succeed. That's where you should go.
And when Gene, sorry, I'm going to beat this dead horse. When Gene talked about killing caterpillars, in addition to the person coming with the hole in the leaf, I had someone come saying, "How do I kill all these caterpillars on my butterfly bush?" To belabor the point of not all insects are bad, you planted a butterfly bush because you want butterflies, and caterpillars are, of course, baby butterflies. So it's not just how do I kill the butterfly, how do I kill their babies, right? So let's make sure we're approaching our pest control in a rational manner.
Although you just mentioned it, I would like to have a little bit more information about the extension service, the soil testing, how that works.
Cooperative Extension exists. Our big charter is to bridge the gap between research and the academy and the real world, whether that's businesses or communities or individuals or whatnot. And so our charter is to bring science and research and translate it and implement it and things like that. And we all have different expertise in the way that we do that. So for homeowners, Extension has a great call-in system at the Ed Center. And so people who have been trained as master gardeners are answering questions that we might have about our home gardens. Anything that they don't know, they ping us. They go to the people who tend to have more of a commercial focus. But on the Extension website, there are forms for submitting. Predominantly soil samples is what people do, but we can also do water samples and tissue samples and things like that. And so then the lab will just run an analysis on it, and then it will come to one of us, and we'll kind of assess how you should be approaching that. There are different types of soil tests you can do. Some people want to pay extra for the organic content of their soil, something I recommend, but that is an upcharge. Distinct from that, we also have our plant diagnostic lab. And unfortunately, there are fees associated with each of these things. But you can send, and again, on the website, there are directions on how to take these samples, but you can send a sick plant to the plant diagnostic lab to have those diseases diagnosed. Of course, I support Extension, and you should use Extension, but your independent garden center is really good at that too. And I don't want to say don't use them. Definitely use your independent garden centers. And we also have an arthropod identification lab as well for buggy things.
The next question is going to come from this lady way over in your left.
Hello, we belong to a community garden. We have a plot, 4 plots that are 4 by 10, and it's managed by a gardener, and he tills it every year, twice a year, in the fall, and then he does it again in the spring. He puts down a cover crop and then we go in after he tills it the last time and, take out rocks and such. Should I assume that area needs to have a amendment to it every season because it's kind of been turned over?
Probably, but you do want a soil test.
So, and if I soil test at that big of an area, how much do I have to take in from all of those areas?
You should. Yeah. Oh, actually, you
follow the directions on the extension website.
Thank you.
There's also a huge movement towards no-till, and that by adding organic material and talking about the subways and the communication, it's doing a lot of that work of breaking up the soil. So the less you disturb the soil, it's probably better. There are certain times when you need to till and you need to do that, but no-till is a huge phase. Not phase, it's what a lot of people are doing now.
You mentioned no-till. I'm not familiar with that. We've been gardening for years, and I'm getting too old, so I'm starting to think about high raised beds, so my knees might be preserved somewhat.
Okay, taking the last question first, the pest problem. One of the best things to do in a situation where you know you're going to get the pest, so you know what the pest is, you can research where they overwinter or where they exist before the time they become on your plant. And then one of the simplest things to do is to put in a physical barrier. A spun-bonded polyester, that's this white filmy cloth that you will see some places that you put out and over your plants. And the insects can't get through it to get to your plant. Sure, it cuts down the sunlight a smidgen, so it's not going to be useful in a place that's really restricted on sunlight. But if you're putting in a good raised bed where you're going to be having plenty of sun, you can actually design the raised bed with a hoop frame in it. You make something that looks like an old Conestoga wagon, except that this very light, thin cloth goes over the top. The sun goes through it. The rain goes through it. You can roll it up on the sides to reach in and take your vegetables and stuff out. But when those insects try to fly in, they can't get to the crop. Because the bees, the pollinators, can't get in there too. I was just last week at the NOFA gardening seminar here in town, and they were talking about taking the paintbrush trick, and you being the pollinator, having to go from blossom to blossom to blossom, which you don't want to think about on a large scale, but if you're doing a raised bed, now you're in a small enough scale, you might want to think about it.
You were talking about the different inputs, what different things might be better for composting, different manures. What I talk about a lot is telling people, listen, if somebody's a really good composter, what they're composting is less important. It doesn't mean that it's not important, but it's somebody who follows world-class composting practices and makes sure everything is broken down, that's going to be a good compost. And there are certain manures that will break down faster. In basic terms, it's that matter of before you use it, what's it feel like? Is it all broken down, as Jean mentioned beforehand? What does it smell like? Does it have any heat? So, people are usually composting what's locally available, and that's what you should do. I wouldn't be super selective on that other than to avoid, too much somebody using chemical fertilizers that you might be trying to compost.
3 quick ones. Number one, I heard someplace that somebody had certified a hydroponic solution as organic. Does anybody know anything about that?
So in America, for a while, people figured out a way to grow hydroponic vegetables using materials that were permitted under the National Organic Protocol. And so they said, this is organic. Boom, and they got an organic seal on it. And then other people said, well, hang on a second. If you're going to break organics down, maybe some folks might disagree with me here, but if you're going to take organics and say it in one sentence, it's feed the soil, don't feed the plants. And if you're going to take hydroponics and boil it down to one sentence, it's feed the plants, don't use soil. And so some people said, how on earth can we be giving organic certification to a process that doesn't use soil? And so the government for a little bit put a hiatus on it, and they said, all right, the folks who are already doing it, you can keep doing it. And then we got to think about it for a while, and no one else new can. Very, very recently, they said, yeah, you know what? That's okay. If you are following the organic protocol and you're growing hydroponically, then you can sell it as organic. The EU said, I think as of 2020, they're not going to accept American-grown organic hydroponics because they disagree with that ruling. A lot of organic farmers in North America disagree with that ruling. For me, can I give my... As an extension agent, I'm not supposed to really have opinions, I found out recently, but I still have a couple. And so I teach hydroponics at the Thompson School, and we run a hydroponics. Our students run a business, and we sell to the local school district. In terms of commercial food production in the Northeast, I think that hydroponics is going to be where we're going. I think that hydroponics, when done right, can use fewer pesticides than organic farming. Whoa, don't beat me up here. And so, for an example, you can go to a market basket now and you can see Olivia's Organics on the shelf, right? And that's soil grown and it's shipped across the country. You know, unfortunately, we're getting these E. coli issues. We're getting issues of human safety in some of this production. Is it clear that I'm stepping very gently here? And it says organic on it, right? But it's from California. Or Arizona. It's got boogers in the bottom already. You buy it, you get it home, you have to eat it in a few days, right? Right next to it on the shelf now, we see Leaf Farms. It does not say organic because it's grown with fertilizers, but it says pesticide free. It says grown in Loudon. Because it was grown in a sterile facility, it wasn't washed. And you should wash it, but them not washing it means that it lasts longer in your refrigerator. And the fact that it came from up the road makes it last longer in your refrigerator. This is much lower I won't go into carbon footprint on that. Some folks in the industry are saying hydroponics, we're actually post-organic. What the customers want when they say they want organic is they don't want pesticides. And we can do that with hydroponics. So I almost think it's a moot discussion. I think the question, can you be organic hydroponic? I'm not sure that's really the right conversation to even be having. And in these conversations with our students, I do believe that growing organically, hydroponically is irresponsible. I believe that the inputs required, because we've been talking about tonight, you need that healthy soil biology to use those organic molecules. Plants don't eat fish. Microbes eat fish, and plants eat the microbe poop, right? So the amount of nutrient that you need to supply to a hydroponic system to get commercial grade production out of it, I think is irresponsible. And I think we're better off using ionic fertilizers, saying it's locally grown, saying it's limited or no pesticide, et cetera, and just forgetting about the organic fertilizer in hydroponics with the understanding that I grow organically in my own yard, and I'm a big fan of both.
Another quick question. I grow tomatoes. What is anybody's take up there on early blight and how to deal with it?
The best thing on early blight is to make sure you have good air circulation around your plants. You don't splash water on the plants, and you rotate where you grow your plants. You know, early blight is going to be in the soil. It can be on your tools, on your clothes. If you use the same gardening gloves every single year, you can be carrying the spores right there. So, you know, if you've had a problem with one of the blights, you really want to think about what ways you may be transporting the spores to your new crop and try to keep that away. That's the most important thing. Later on, you get to, sure, some varieties may be a little less susceptible to it. A more vigorously growing plant can tolerate a little bit more blight on it. But get that air circulation around it so that the plant dries off. Do not water the plant in the evening. Water it just before the sun hits it so that it dries off fast.
I just wanted to say quickly, thank you all for being here, and I wanted you It might be a benefit to those of you who work maybe with some school gardens. We do something called our Growing Good program, and we will give compost to school gardens. And the point of the program, obviously, is to get the kids interested in gardening, organic practices. But the other piece that is close to us is sending somebody to a local garden center where we're supplying the soil and where we're crediting the local garden center, but instead of that school going to Home Depot or Lowe's, they're going to a local garden center to pick up their products, and hopefully they're building a relationship and strengthening the community. So check out our website. We might be able to help out your local school garden.
So please join me in thanking our panel. Guys did a great job.